I was walking home from my shift at Miller's Grocery when I spotted the moving truck parked outside the old Henderson house on Pine Street. The place had been empty for nearly a year since the Hendersons packed up and left without saying goodbye to anyone. That happened a lot in our town. A woman with dark hair was hauling boxes from the truck to the front porch by herself, working at a steady pace despite the chill in the air. I checked my watch, just past 5:30. The sun was already sinking behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Not much daylight left. At 23, I'd seen plenty of people move to our little corner of Alaska with big dreams about wilderness living, only to flee before winter fully set in. Something about this woman made me think she might be another temporary resident. Maybe the confident way she moved, like someone who hadn't yet learned to be careful here. I hesitated at the end of the driveway. My grandfather had taught me to be wary of strangers, but he'd also stressed the importance of looking out for people who didn't know the rules. And this woman definitely didn't know the rules. "Need some help?" I called, walking up the gravel driveway. She turned, surprised, then smiled. I wouldn't turn it down. She set down a box and wiped her hands on her jeans. "I'm Jessica Collins." "Emily Turner," I said, picking up a medium-sized box labeled "Kitchen" from the back of the truck. "Welcome to Blackwood." "Thanks." Jessica grabbed another box. "Seems like a quiet town?" "It is," I said, following her into the house. The interior smelled musty from sitting empty, but the bones of the place were solid. "Where are you from?" "Anchorage originally, but I've been in Seattle the last few years." She set her box down in what would be the living room once it was furnished. "Got offered a remote position and decided to come back to Alaska, somewhere a bit more isolated this time." I nodded, placing my box on the counter in the kitchen. "Well, housing's cheap here, that's for sure." "That's what sold me," Jessica laughed. "That and the views." We made several trips back and forth from the truck. I learned she was a technical writer who could work from anywhere with an internet connection. She asked about the town, best places to eat, the diner or the pub, our only options, grocery shopping, Miller's, where I worked, and general community vibe. Close-knit, I told her, though I didn't mention why we all stayed so connected. As we unloaded, I kept glancing at my watch. Just after 6 now. The daylight was fading fast. "You seem in a hurry," Jessica commented as we carried in a small bookshelf together. "Not exactly," I said, trying to sound casual. "It's just getting dark soon." "And?" She raised an eyebrow as we set the shelf down. I took a breath. This was always the awkward part with newcomers. "It's not safe to be outside after dark here, especially not alone." Jessica laughed, the reaction I expected. "Bears? Wolves?" "Something like that," I said, not wanting to get into specifics. Nobody ever believed the specifics anyway. "We have a rule in town. Everyone inside by 7. Doors locked, windows shut." "A curfew?" Her tone was amused. I didn't realize I was moving to a town with a curfew. "It's not official or anything, just something everyone does." I grabbed another box from the truck. The temperature was dropping as the sun sank lower. "You'll want to finish unloading quickly." Jessica shook her head, still smiling. "I'm not afraid of a little Alaska wilderness. I grew up here, remember?" "Anchorage is different," I said, trying not to sound pushy. "Our town has specific challenges." "Like what?" She was giving me that look city people always gave locals, like we were quaint with our superstitions and small-town ways. "Wildlife behaves differently here," I said, which wasn't a lie. "There's a reason for the 7 p.m. rule. It's kept people safe." "Well, I appreciate the warning, but I've got bear spray and I know how to use it." Jessica picked up a lamp from the truck. "Besides, I've got at least a dozen more boxes to unload and I need my bed set up tonight." I glanced at my watch again. 6:30. My house was a 15-minute walk from here. "I could come back tomorrow morning to help," I offered. "First light." I don't work until noon. That's really nice of you, but I'll be fine. Jessica waved off my concern. This isn't my first time in Alaska. But it was her first time in Blackwood, and that made all the difference. I helped her carry in a few more boxes, growing increasingly anxious as the minutes ticked by. The shadows around the house were deepening, and I could feel the familiar tension in the air that came with approaching nightfall. Really, you should get the essentials inside and leave the rest for tomorrow, I tried again. Jessica laughed. You make it sound like the boogeyman comes out at night. If only she knew how close to the truth that was. Small towns have their rules for reasons, I said, trying one more time. Even if they seem silly to newcomers. I'm sure they do. Jessica's tone was indulgent. But I've got work to do, and I'm not stopping because of some superstition. I looked at my watch again. 6:45. The sun was nearly gone now, just a faint glow on the horizon. Jessica continued working, carrying boxes from the truck to the house, completely oblivious to the approaching danger. I stood on her porch, feeling the weight of the decision I needed to make. I could stay and try to protect her, breaking my grandfather's most important rule in the process. Or I could leave her to face whatever might come after dark, when she clearly had no idea what she was up against. The clock was ticking towards 7 p.m., and Jessica showed no signs of stopping her unpacking. I closed my front door at 2 minutes past 7, my heart pounding as I leaned against it. The town rule echoed in my head. Everyone inside by 7, doors locked, windows shut. I'd barely made it home in time. The 15-minute walk from Jessica's house had taken me just 12 minutes tonight. I'd practically jogged the whole way, feeling the darkness creeping in around me with each passing second. The relief of making it home safely washed over me, but it was short-lived. Jessica was still out there, still unloading boxes from her truck, still completely unaware. I flipped on every light in my small 2-bedroom house, a habit ingrained since childhood. My grandfather had taught me that darkness invited things in, even indoors. I checked that all my windows were properly locked and drew the curtains tight. Then I began to pace. The living room of my house wasn't large, just enough space for a worn couch, a coffee table, and the rocking chair that had belonged to my grandmother. I circled this furniture again and again, checking my phone every few minutes. No texts, no calls. The silence made my stomach twist. At 7:15, I couldn't stand it anymore. I pulled up Jessica's number, which she'd given me when I helped her move the first few boxes. The phone rang and rang. No answer, not even voicemail. Come on, Jessica, I muttered, trying again. Still nothing. I dropped onto the couch, my phone clutched in my hand. Maybe she was fine. Maybe she'd finished unloading, gone inside, and turned off her phone to get some sleep after the long day. Maybe she'd taken my warning seriously after all. But I knew better. I'd seen the dismissive look in her eyes, heard the amusement in her voice when I mentioned the curfew. Jessica didn't believe there was any danger. And people who didn't believe were the ones who disappeared. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, where I kept a large container of salt on the counter. Not table salt, rock salt, coarse and heavy. Next to it sat a powerful flashlight, the kind with a beam that could cut through the thickest darkness. My grandfather's voice seemed to fill the room. Never go out after dark, Emily. Not for anyone. Not for anything. Robert Turner had raised me with rules that kept people alive in Blackwood. Rules I'd never broken. Until now. I grabbed the salt container and flashlight, stuffing them into a small backpack along with extra batteries. I put on my heaviest jacket and sturdiest boots. If I was going to break the most important rule, I'd at least be prepared. As I reached for the door handle, I hesitated. The consequences of what I was about to do crashed over me, but the alternative, leaving Jessica to whatever might find her, seemed worse. I opened the door. The night air hit me immediately, carrying with it a wrongness I couldn't quite name. During the day, Blackwood was just a small town nestled among pine trees and mountains. But after dark, it transformed into something else. The darkness between streetlights seemed deeper than it should be. The silence was too complete, as if the town was holding its breath. I stepped onto my porch and locked the door behind me. The street was empty, all houses buttoned up tight with lights glowing behind drawn curtains. No one would see me breaking the rule. No one would come to help if I needed it. The walk to Pine Street normally took 15 minutes, but I moved quickly, staying under streetlights whenever possible. The darkness between them felt like wading through cold water. I could hear whispers coming from the shadows between houses. Not quite words, but sounds that mimicked human speech just enough to make my skin crawl. I kept the flashlight beam pointed at the ground directly in front of me, not daring to shine it into the deeper darkness. Looking directly at what moved in the night only invited its attention. Pine Street appeared deserted when I turned the corner. Jessica's moving truck still sat in the driveway of the old Henderson house, but something was wrong. The truck's back door hung open. Boxes were scattered across the front yard and porch, as if dropped suddenly. The front door of the house stood wide open. "Jessica," I called, my voice sounding thin in the night air. No response. I approached cautiously, my hand tight around the flashlight. When I reached the porch steps, I set down my backpack and pulled out the salt container. With practiced movements, I poured a thick line across the threshold of the open door. Salt kept things out. It also kept them in. I wasn't sure which I might need tonight. "Jessica?" I called again, stepping over my salt line and into the house. "It's Emily from earlier. Are you okay?" The interior was dark except for a single lamp in the living room, casting long shadows across the half-unpacked boxes. I moved through the space slowly, keeping my salt container ready. In the kitchen, I found Jessica's purse sitting on the counter next to her car keys. She hadn't left voluntarily. My chest tightened as I continued through the house, checking each room. The bedroom held only a bare mattress on the floor. The bathroom was empty. When I reached the back of the house, I found the rear door standing open as well, cool night air flowing in. I poured another salt line across this threshold before stepping out onto the small back porch. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a small backyard that ended at a line of trees about 50 feet from the house. The forest edge was a black wall beyond my light's reach. I swept the beam across the ground and caught the distinct imprint of footsteps in the mud near the porch steps. They led from the house toward the tree line. A single set of prints that looked like they belonged to Jessica's boots. I followed the beam along the tracks until they disappeared into the grass about halfway to the forest. Something had happened there. The grass was flattened in a strange pattern, too large and irregular for a person to have made by simply falling. Standing at the edge of my salt line, I strained to hear any sound that might tell me what had happened to Jessica. For a moment, there was nothing but the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then I heard it, movement in the darkness beyond the house, not the wind. Something larger pushing through underbrush. It could have been Jessica, wandering lost in the dark, or it could have been something else. The forest rule was as old as the town itself. Never enter the woods after sunset. Even during daylight, never go alone. The forest belonged to them after dark. Everyone in Blackwood knew this. I stood frozen at the edge of the salt line, my flashlight pointed toward the sound of movement, listening as it grew fainter. Jessica was out there somewhere, possibly heading deeper into the forest, and I had to decide whether to follow. I dragged myself back home after midnight, my boots heavy with mud and fear. The weight of what I'd discovered at Jessica's house, the open doors, the scattered boxes, the footprints leading toward the forest, pressed down on me as I locked my door and checked every window twice. Sleep wasn't an option. I knew what happened to people who went into the forest after dark. I'd been raised on the stories since childhood, but I'd never had to face the reality so directly before. Usually the townspeople who disappeared were those who broke the rules knowingly or newcomers who hadn't been properly warned. Jessica had been warned. She just hadn't believed. I called the state police at 12:15. The dispatcher told me they couldn't send anyone until morning because of a storm system moving through the mountain passes. I tried explaining it was an emergency. A woman missing, signs of a struggle. But weather trumped everything else in Alaska. The earliest they could dispatch someone was 8 in the morning. Next, I called our local police. Blackwood's force consisted of 3 officers, and tonight, Officer Daniel Kim was on duty. I'd known Daniel since high school. He'd grown up here, same as me, which meant he understood the rules without me having to explain. "I'll meet you at her house at first light," he told me after I explained what happened. "Don't go back there alone, Emily. Not even during daylight." "I won't," I promised, though the temptation to return immediately was strong. I spent the rest of the night researching forest disappearances on my laptop. Our town had a long history of people going missing. Some were found, usually dead from exposure or animal attacks, according to official reports. Others were never found at all. The pattern was familiar to anyone who grew up here, but seeing the statistics laid out made my stomach hurt. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. I watched the sky lighten from gray to pale blue through my kitchen window, counting the minutes until it was safe to go outside. At 6:30, with the sun finally clearing the mountains, I grabbed my backpack, still containing salt and flashlight, and headed for Pine Street. Daniel was already at Jessica's house when I arrived, his police cruiser parked behind her moving truck. He stood on the front porch with his notebook out, looking tired but alert. Daniel was in his early 30s, his black hair neatly trimmed beneath his police cap, his uniform pressed despite the early hour. "Any sign of her?" I asked, knowing the answer but hoping anyway. He shook his head. "House is clear. Back door was still open like you said." "I need to file a missing person report," I said. "Let's do that. But first, tell me everything that happened last night." I walked him through the events, meeting Jessica while she was unloading, warning her about the 7 p.m. rule, rushing home as darkness fell, then coming back after 7 when she didn't answer her phone. "And you found footprints leading toward the forest?" His pen hovered over his notebook. "Yes, a single set. They looked like they matched her boots." Daniel wrote this down, his expression carefully neutral. "You saw signs of a struggle?" The grass was flattened in a weird pattern, not like someone just fell. He nodded. "And you're sure she was alone when you left her?" "Yes, just her and her boxes." I looked at the moving truck, its back door still hanging open. "Can we go inside? I want to check something." Daniel followed me into Jessica's house. In the daylight, it looked even more disrupted than it had the night before. Boxes half unpacked, belongings scattered across the floor. Nothing had been taken as far as I could tell. Her purse still sat on the kitchen counter, wallet inside. "What exactly are we looking for?" Daniel asked. "I'm not sure. Something that might tell us why she went outside after dark." We moved through the house methodically. In the living room, I spotted Jessica's laptop open on a stack of moving boxes that served as a makeshift table. The screen was dark, but when I pressed a key, it lit up without asking for a password. "Daniel," I called, "look at this." He came over as I scrolled through Jessica's browser history. Dozens of searches about Blackwood, our town's history, local folklore, missing persons cases. She'd been researching us before she even arrived. "She knew," I whispered. "She knew about the disappearances." "But not what caused them," Daniel said, his voice tight. "Otherwise, she wouldn't have gone out after dark." I clicked on a folder on her desktop labeled Blackwood Research. Inside were PDF files of newspaper articles, forum discussions, and personal accounts of strange occurrences in our town. Jessica had organized them by date, going back decades. "She wasn't just moving here," I said, the realization dawning on me. She was investigating us. Daniel leaned closer to the screen. Check that folder, missing persons. I opened it to find 7 subfolders, each labeled with a name. The first was Alex Murphy. I recognized the name immediately. Alex had disappeared 3 years ago after breaking curfew. He'd gone to the edge of the forest to smoke, a habit he hid from his parents, and never returned. The other 6 names were also familiar, all people who had gone missing in Blackwood over the past decade, all cases that officially remained unsolved. There's something else, I said, noticing a stack of printed papers beside the laptop. I picked them up and found Jessica's handwritten notes in the margins. Most were questions or connections she was trying to make between cases. One phrase appeared repeatedly: the collectors. Have you ever heard of that? I asked Daniel, pointing to the words. He shook his head. Not by that name. I continued reading. Jessica had made notes about doppelgangers and people who look like missing residents but act strangely. On one page she'd written, "Town rule, trash, protection from collectors." My hands went cold. Jessica hadn't just been researching folklore. She'd been getting close to the truth. Daniel, I said slowly, how much of this makes it into official police reports? He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the papers in my hands. Finally, he sighed and took off his cap, running a hand through his hair. None of it, he admitted. We write up the disappearances as standard missing persons cases, sometimes as probable hiking accidents or animal attacks if we find remains. You've been covering it up. What choice do we have? His voice had an edge I hadn't heard before. You think the state police would believe the truth? You think any outside authority would accept what's really happening here? He was right, of course. I'd tried telling a summer camp counselor about the rules when I was 12. She'd laughed it off as small-town superstition. She disappeared 3 weeks later. The disappearances are getting worse, Daniel continued, lowering his voice though we were alone in the house. More frequent. Before, it was maybe one person every few years. Now it's 1 or 2 a year. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and spread it on top of Jessica's laptop. It was a map of Blackwood and the surrounding forest, with red X marks scattered across it. Each mark is where someone went missing or where we found signs. His finger traced a pattern I hadn't noticed before. The marks clustered around the eastern forest, forming a rough circle centered on something. The old mining tunnels, I said, recognizing the area. Blackwood had started as a mining town in the late 1800s. When the ore ran out, most of the operations shut down, leaving miles of abandoned tunnels under the forest. We've never found a connection before, Daniel said. But Jessica might have been onto something with this collector's theory. Whatever takes people, it brings them somewhere. A chill ran through me. I'd always imagined the victims were simply gone, killed by whatever lurked in the darkness. The idea that they might be taken somewhere, collected for some purpose, was somehow worse. We need to report this to someone, I said. Get help. Who? The state police? They'll think we're crazy. And even if they believe us enough to search the tunnels, they'll go in unprepared. More people will disappear. Before I could respond, I heard something that made my blood freeze. My name, called in a familiar voice from outside the house. Emily, are you in there? It's Jessica. Daniel and I looked at each other. His hand moved to his gun. I stepped to the window and peered out into the backyard. Jessica stood there in the same clothes she'd worn yesterday, waving at the house. She was smiling, but the smile was wrong. It was too wide, too fixed, and the way she stood, perfectly still between waves like she was posing for a photo, sent alarm bells ringing through my head. That's not Jessica, I whispered to Daniel, backing away from the window. Something's wrong with how she's moving. Emily, the voice called again. I need your help. Can you come outside? The thing that looked like Jessica took a step toward the house, still wearing that wrong smile. I felt a cold wave of recognition wash over me. The stiff movements, the fixed expression, the voice that sounded right but had a strange, hollow quality to it, like someone reading lines they didn't understand. "Don't answer it," I told Daniel, grabbing his arm as he moved toward the window. "Don't even let it know we can see it." He looked at me, confusion clear on his face. "What do you mean, it? That's Jessica Collins." I shook my head. "No, it's not. I've seen this before." 3 years ago, Alex Murphy disappeared after breaking curfew. 2 days later, something wearing Alex's face showed up at the town diner during lunch rush. It sat at a booth, ordered food, but didn't eat. Just smiled at everyone who passed. Old Mrs. Fincher tried talking to it, thinking her grandson's friend had returned. She said later that its eyes weren't right, too dark, too empty. "Daniel, remember what happened with Alex?" Recognition flashed across his face. "You think this is the same thing?" "Emily!" The voice was louder now, more insistent. "Please, I need to talk to you about what I found in the forest. It's important." I pulled Daniel away from the window. "We need salt, now." He nodded and followed me to the kitchen. I yanked open cabinets until I found a container of table salt. Not as good as rock salt, but it would have to do. I poured thick lines across the threshold of every door, every windowsill. "Emily, what are you doing?" The Jessica thing's voice had taken on a desperate edge. "I can see you in there. Why won't you help me?" Daniel drew his service weapon, keeping it pointed at the floor but ready. "I'm calling for backup," he said, reaching for his radio. "Who's going to come?" I asked, still making salt lines. "Nobody's going to enter the forest area during daylight. Not after what happened to Officer Peterson last year." Daniel knew I was right. Our small police force had learned the hard way that the forest wasn't safe even in broad daylight. Officer Peterson had gone in alone to look for a missing hiker and came back wrong. He took sick leave 2 days later and never returned to work. A sharp tapping sound made us both jump. The Jessica thing was at the back window now, knuckles rapping against the glass in a steady rhythm. "It's just like what happened to Lonnie," I said quietly. "Rodriguez? From the hardware store?" I nodded. 5 years ago, Lonnie had been home alone when something started tapping on her bedroom window. It wore her mother's face, but couldn't speak properly. Lonnie was smart enough to stay inside until morning. She said the thing stood outside her window all night, just tapping and smiling. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I finished the salt line on the last windowsill and moved to where I could see the creature without being too close to the glass. Now that I was looking directly at it, the differences between this thing and the real Jessica were obvious. Its skin had a waxy, too smooth quality. The color wasn't quite right. Slightly too pale, like a photo with the contrast turned down. But the eyes were the worst part. From a distance, they looked normal, but up close, I could see they were completely black with no whites at all. Just endless dark pools that reflected nothing. "Emily, please," it said, its mouth moving in a way that didn't quite match the words. "I'm scared. I found something in the forest. I need your help." Daniel raised his radio to his lips. "This is Officer Kim. I need assistance at the Henderson house on Pine Street. Possible 1054. The code for a possible body. Static was his only answer." "No one's coming," I said. "We're on our own." The Jessica thing had started moving again, circling around to the front of the house. We heard the front door handle rattle, then the side door, then back to the windows, testing every possible entrance. "Why can't it get in?" Daniel asked, tracking the sounds of movement. "The salt," I said. "They can't cross it. I don't know why, but it's always worked. My grandfather taught me." The creature's behavior was changing. The sweet, pleading voice gave way to a lower, angry tone. "Let me in, Emily. Let me in now." Each word was punctuated by a hard knock against the nearest window. The glass rattled in its frame. I moved back to Jessica's laptop, looking for anything that might help us understand what we were dealing with. The folder labeled "The Collectors" caught my eye again. I opened it and began scanning through the documents. "Daniel, look at this." He kept his gun trained on the nearest window, but glanced at the screen. Jessica had compiled newspaper clippings, forum posts, and personal accounts of encounters with what locals sometimes called the Hollow People. Creatures that looked like missing residents but behaved strangely. One account from 1978 described a woman whose husband went missing in the forest. 3 days later, she saw him standing at the edge of their property, staring at their house. When she approached him, she noticed his eyes were black as coal, and his movements were like someone learning to use their limbs. Another report from 1992 mentioned a teenager who disappeared after sunset. A week later, something with his face was seen trying to convince his younger brother to go into the forest with him. Pattern after pattern emerged from Jessica's research. People would go missing, usually after breaking the sunset rule. Days later, something wearing their appearance would return, trying to lure others away. And then I found it, a map of the old mining tunnels that ran beneath the eastern forest. Jessica had marked locations where people had disappeared, creating a cluster of X's around the main entrance to the abandoned mine. Next to the map, she'd written, "Are they kept somewhere inside? Still alive?" The thought hit me like a physical blow. What if the real Jessica was still alive? What if all the missing people were? "They're taking people to the mines," I said, pointing to the map. "Jessica figured it out. That's why she went out after dark. She wanted proof." The banging on the windows had stopped. An eerie silence fell over the house. Daniel and I exchanged glances, both wondering what the creature was doing now. "Officer Kim," a voice crackled over Daniel's radio, making us both jump. "This is dispatch. Be advised we cannot send backup to your location until road conditions improve. Status report requested." Daniel pressed the talk button. "Situation contained for now. Possible 1056. Person acting erratically." "Copy that. Maintain position. Additional units when available." I turned back to the laptop, searching for more information. In a subfolder labeled Transformations, I found Jessica's notes about the physical characteristics of the creatures. They seemed to be imperfect copies, getting the general appearance right but missing subtle details. Their behavior became more convincing over time, as if they were learning how to be human. Most importantly, Jessica had theorized that the real people might still be alive somewhere, kept in a suspended state while these things used their appearances and memories to lure more victims. A loud crash from the kitchen made us both spin around. The Jessica thing had thrown something through the window, a rock from the garden, shattering the glass. But it still couldn't enter because of the unbroken salt line on the windowsill. "We can't stay here," I said. "That thing is getting more aggressive, and we don't know if there are more of them out there." Daniel nodded grimly. "What's the plan? Wait for backup?" I looked at Jessica's research spread across the laptop screen, her maps, her theories, her careful documentation of the patterns. "Every hour we wait, Jessica, the real Jessica, could be lost forever," I said. "If she's in those mining tunnels, we need to find her now." "Emily, think about what you're saying," Daniel replied, his voice tense. "You want us to go into the forest? To those tunnels? With these things out there?" I looked out the window at the Jessica thing. It stood perfectly still in the yard now, watching the house with those black eyes, waiting. "We need to go while it's still daylight," I said. "We have maybe 8 hours until sunset. If Jessica's right, the real victims are being held somewhere in those tunnels, and if we don't get to them soon..." I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't need to. We both knew what was at stake. Daniel looked at me like I had suggested we jump off a cliff. Emily, that's crazy. We don't know what's out there or how many of those things exist. We know exactly what's out there. It's taking people. I pointed to the creature still watching us from the yard, its black eyes fixed on the house. That thing wearing Jessica's face? It's not going away, and there could be others. So, your plan is to walk straight into where they come from? Daniel's voice rose in disbelief. I turned the laptop toward him, showing Jessica's maps of the mining tunnels. She marked all the places people disappeared. They cluster around the old mine entrance. That can't be coincidence. Daniel ran a hand across his face. He looked torn between protocol and the reality we both knew existed in Blackwood. If we wait for backup from state troopers who don't understand what's happening, more people might disappear, I said. And I don't want that Jessica thing following me home. He stared at the map for another long moment, then sighed. Okay, but we do this smart. We need supplies. I smiled with relief. Salt. Lots of it. And more than that. Daniel checked his service weapon. I need to get back to the station for extra ammunition. And we need better flashlights than what you've got. I'll grab everything I can from Jessica's kitchen, I said, already moving toward the cabinets. Meet back here in 30 minutes. Make it 20. While Daniel slipped out the front door, gun drawn as he watched for the creature, I ransacked Jessica's kitchen. I found 2 large containers of salt and poured them into plastic bags. In her bedroom, I discovered a heavy-duty flashlight in her emergency kit, along with spare batteries. I kept glancing out windows to track the Jessica thing's movements. It circled the house, testing doors and windows, its movements growing jerky with what looked like frustration. Daniel returned in 18 minutes, carrying a duffel bag. The thing followed me halfway to the station before turning back, he said, locking the door behind him. I think it's focused on this house. He unpacked his supplies, extra ammunition for his service pistol, 2 police-issue tactical flashlights, a first aid kit, walkie-talkies, and 3 large containers of rock salt. Found these at the station, he explained, holding up the salt. Old man Turner, your grandfather, convinced the town council years ago that every public building should keep some on hand. I felt a pang of gratitude for my grandfather's insistence on safety measures most people thought crazy. How do we get past that thing outside? I asked. Daniel pointed to the backyard. It's at the front door now. We can leave through the back. Use the salt to create a path if it follows. We stuffed the supplies into backpacks, and Daniel handed me one of the walkie-talkies. Keep this on. If we get separated... He didn't finish the sentence. We won't, I said with more confidence than I felt. We slipped out the back door, laying down a salt line behind us. The creature must have sensed our movement because it let out a sound, not quite human, not quite animal, and rushed around the side of the house. But our salt trail forced it to stay several feet away as we made our way to Daniel's police cruiser parked out front. Don't look at it, I warned as we climbed in. The Jessica thing stood in the street, watching us with its black eyes and wrong smile. Daniel started the car and accelerated away from Pine Street. In the side mirror, I saw the creature standing motionless in the middle of the road, getting smaller as we drove off. It knows where we're going, I said. Maybe, but we'll get there first. We drove east through town toward the old logging road that led to the abandoned mining complex. Few people used that road anymore. The town had blocked it off with concrete barriers after the mine closed in the 1950s. But Daniel knew a Forest Service access point that would get us within a mile of the main entrance. As we left the town limits, I felt my stomach tighten. I'd never been this far into the eastern forest, not even during daylight. All my life I'd followed the forest rule. Never go alone, never after dark. The trees seemed to press closer to the road here, their shadows deeper than they should be, even in midday sun. You okay? Daniel asked, glancing at me. Just breaking a lifetime habit. He nodded in understanding. I haven't been out here in years. Not since that search party for the Russell kid. I remembered that case. A 12-year-old boy who'd gone into the forest on a dare and never came back. The search party found nothing. Not even tracks. Daniel parked at the end of a narrow dirt road marked Forest Service personnel only. From here, we'd have to continue on foot. The mining complex was about a 15-minute hike through dense forest, according to Jessica's map. We checked our supplies one last time. Daniel holstered his gun but kept his hand near it as we started walking. The forest felt wrong. That was the only way I could describe it. The bird sounds were too sparse, the air too still. Even the smell was off, like wet earth but with something sharp and metallic underneath. There, Daniel pointed ahead after we'd walked about 10 minutes. A concrete structure emerged from the hillside, the modern entrance to the old mining tunnels built over the original wooden one when the company shut down operations. The heavy metal door that should have sealed the entrance hung open, its lock broken long ago. Recent footprints marked the dirt around it, coming and going in no clear pattern. Someone's been using this regularly, Daniel said, kneeling to examine the tracks. Not someone, I corrected. Something. We clicked on our flashlights and stepped into the tunnel mouth. The air grew colder immediately, carrying the smell of damp stone and something else I couldn't identify. The main passage sloped downward, railway tracks still embedded in the floor though the metal had rusted to a deep orange. Our lights revealed walls supported by old wooden beams, many sagging under decades of pressure. Parts of the ceiling had collapsed, creating debris piles we had to climb over. "Watch your step," Daniel warned as loose rocks slid under our feet. We followed the main tunnel for what felt like forever, though my watch showed only 12 minutes had passed. The passage branched occasionally, but we stuck to the primary route where the footprints were most numerous. Then I spotted something that made me stop cold. Drag marks in the dirt, wide and continuous, as if heavy objects had been pulled along the ground. "Daniel," I whispered, pointing my light at the marks. He knelt again, examining the pattern. "These look recent, maybe a few days old." "Bodies?" He nodded grimly. "Probably." The thought of Jessica being dragged through these dark tunnels made my skin crawl. We continued forward, following both footprints and drag marks deeper into the earth. The main tunnel eventually opened into a larger area, some kind of loading station where mining carts would have been filled. Old equipment lay scattered about, rusted beyond recognition. 3 smaller tunnels branched off from this chamber. "Which way?" Daniel asked. I was about to suggest we check each tunnel when I heard it. A voice, faint but clear, coming from the leftmost passage. "Help! Somebody help me!" It was Jessica's voice. Daniel and I exchanged glances. After seeing the thing with Jessica's face at her house, we both knew this could be another trap. "We go carefully," he said, drawing his gun. The left tunnel narrowed quickly, forcing us to walk single file. The drag marks were more pronounced here, cutting deep lines into the packed dirt floor. Water dripped somewhere ahead, creating a steady rhythm like a broken clock. The voice came again, closer this time. "Is someone there? Please help." We emerged into another chamber, this one larger than the loading station. Our flashlight beams couldn't reach the far walls or ceiling, creating the impression of standing in an endless void. But what they did illuminate made my blood freeze. 5 people sat slumped against the near wall, arranged in a semicircle. Their eyes were closed, bodies motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of breathing. Jessica was among them, still wearing the clothes I'd last seen her in. Beside her was a man I recognized with shock, Alex Murphy, who had disappeared 3 years ago. The other 3 were townspeople who had gone missing over the past decade. An older woman who had been the librarian. A teenage boy from 2 summers ago. A middle-aged man I remembered as working at the gas station. All of them looked alive but unconscious, their skin pale from lack of sunlight, their bodies thin but not emaciated. "Jessica!" Daniel rushed forward, kneeling beside her. Jessica, can you hear me?" I started to follow, but stopped when I noticed movement in the darkness beyond our light beams. Something was shifting in the shadows, something that didn't make a sound as it moved. "Daniel," I hissed, "we're not alone." I unslung my backpack and pulled out the salt containers. With shaking hands, I began pouring a thick line in a circle around the 5 captives and Daniel, moving as quickly as I could. "They won't wake up," Daniel said, checking Jessica's pulse, "but they're alive, all of them." As my salt circle neared completion, the shadows at the edges of the chamber seemed to deepen. I heard a sound like fabric dragging across stone, then another that resembled whispers just below the threshold of understanding. "Hurry!" Daniel urged, drawing his gun again and pointing it toward the darkness. I finished the salt circle just as the first of them emerged into our flashlight beams. It wore Alex Murphy's face, but wrong, the features too perfect, too symmetrical. Behind it came another wearing the librarian's appearance, then one with the gas station attendant's face. Each moved with that same unsettling stiffness I'd seen in the Jessica thing at the house. More shapes appeared behind them. Dozens of them, each wearing the face of someone who had gone missing in Blackwood over the years. Some I recognized from old photographs or missing person flyers. Others were strangers to me. "Oh God," I whispered. "They've been doing this for decades." The creatures stopped at the edge of our light, forming a loose circle around us. Each had those same black eyes, empty pools that reflected nothing, not even our flashlight beams. One stepped forward, the false Jessica. Its mouth opened in that too wide smile. "Emily," it said in Jessica's voice, though the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You shouldn't have come here." Another spoke, this one wearing Alex's face. "This place isn't for you." The voice was Alex's, but overlaid with something else. A second voice speaking the same words a fraction of a second later. Then they all began speaking, a cacophony of familiar and unfamiliar voices, some overlapping, some finishing each other's sentences. "You belong up there, in the light. We belong down here, in the dark, with our collection." The false Jessica took another step toward our salt circle, "But now you can join them." It reached out a hand toward the salt line, not touching it but hovering just above. The other creatures did the same, surrounding our circle completely, testing for weaknesses. Daniel kept his gun trained on the false Jessica, though we both knew bullets probably wouldn't stop these things. "What do they want?" he whispered to me. I stared at the 5 unconscious people behind us, then at the dozens of creatures wearing human faces, and the horrible truth clicked into place. "They're collecting," I said, "taking people and copying them somehow, using their forms to get more victims." The creatures had completely surrounded our salt circle now. They began moving slowly around it, maintaining perfect distance from the barrier. Their black eyes never blinked. Their movements grew more fluid as they circled, as if they were learning to move better just by watching us. "Emily Turner," several voices said at once. "We've been waiting for you to break the rules." The creatures continued their slow circle around us, their movements becoming more fluid with each rotation, as if they were learning from watching us. Their black eyes never left us as they tested the salt line for any break or weakness. I clutched the nearly empty salt container to my chest, watching as one of the creatures, the false Alex, reached toward our barrier. Its hand hovered just above the white granules, not quite touching. A low hiss escaped its mouth when it got too close. "They can't cross it," I whispered to Daniel, "but I don't know how long it will hold them back." Daniel knelt beside Jessica, checking her pulse again. "We need to wake them up. If we can get them moving, we might have a chance to escape." I joined him, shaking Jessica's shoulders gently. "Jessica, can you hear me?" Her head lolled to the side, but her eyelids fluttered. A good sign. Try Alex, I suggested, moving to check on the librarian and the teenage boy. Daniel grabbed Alex's shoulders and spoke loudly near his ear. "Alex! Alex Murphy! Wake up!" Alex's eyes opened suddenly. Normal human eyes, not the black pools of the creatures. He looked around in confusion, his gaze unfocused. "What? Where am I?" His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "You're in the old mining tunnels," Daniel explained, keeping his tone calm despite the creatures circling us. "You've been missing for 3 years." Alex's eyes widened. 3 years. I watched the creatures as Daniel worked to fully wake Alex. Their circling had become more agitated, faster. The false Jessica kept reaching toward the salt line, pulling back each time with that same hissing sound. It was testing the barrier, looking for a way through. I turned my attention back to Jessica, tapping her face lightly. "Jessica, wake up. We need to go." Her eyes opened slowly, blinking against our flashlight beams. "Emily?" "Yes, it's me. We found you. You were right about the mining tunnels." Recognition dawned on her face, followed by fear. "The things in the forest..." "We know," I cut in. "They're here, all around us." Jessica struggled to sit up straighter, looking past me at the circling creatures. I saw her eyes lock onto her doppelganger, and she let out a small cry of shock. "That's me." "Just a copy," I assured her. "A bad one." We managed to wake the teenage boy as well, though the older woman and the gas station attendant remained unconscious despite our efforts. The 3 who were awake were weak, barely able to move without help. The creatures had picked up their pace, moving faster around our circle. I noticed with growing horror that the salt line was thinning in places. Whether from the creature's influence or just the natural spread of granules on the uneven ground, I couldn't tell. "Daniel," I whispered, nodding toward a spot where the line looked dangerously thin. "We're losing the barrier." He saw it too and reached for his salt container but found it empty. I checked mine, just a handful left. "We need more salt," he said, scanning the chamber with his flashlight. The beam caught something in the corner of the room, an old mining cart, half filled with what looked like white rocks. I squinted at it, trying to make out the details from across the chamber. "Is that..." I started. "Rock salt," Daniel confirmed, his voice rising with hope. "The miners used it to melt ice in the tunnels during winter." The cart sat about 20 feet from our circle, near what looked like the main entrance to this chamber. If we could reach it, we might have enough salt to create a path all the way back to the surface. "We need a plan," I said, keeping my voice low. "That salt line won't hold forever." Daniel nodded, thinking. "I could try to make a break for it, get to the cart and bring some back." "They'd surround you before you made it halfway," I said. "But what if we extend our circle?" I showed him the small amount of salt I had left. "If I pour this in a path, you could follow it to the cart, then bring back enough to reinforce our circle and create an escape route." The creatures sensed we were planning something. They moved even faster now, their whispers growing louder. The false Jessica pressed closer to the salt line, its black eyes fixed on me. "Don't leave us," Alex pleaded weakly. "We'll be right back," Daniel assured him. "Just stay inside the circle." I took a deep breath and began carefully pouring a thin salt line from our circle toward the cart, trying to make my limited supply stretch as far as possible. The creatures followed my movement, gathering on the side where I was working. "Ready?" I asked Daniel when the line extended about 5 feet from our circle. He drew his gun and nodded. "Go." I continued pouring, walking backward slowly, while Daniel followed right behind me, keeping his weapon trained on the nearest creatures. They hissed and backed away from the extending salt line but kept pace with us, looking for any gap. Halfway to the cart, my container ran empty. I shook the last few granules onto the ground, creating a line that almost reached the cart but fell short by about 3 feet. "I'm out," I whispered to Daniel. Without hesitating, he handed me his gun and pulled off his uniform shirt, revealing a white undershirt beneath. He twisted the shirt into a rope-like shape and tossed one end across the gap, landing it in the mining cart among the rock salt. "Pull some onto the shirt," he instructed. I tucked the gun into my waistband and reached out, carefully tugging on the shirt to gather rock salt onto the fabric. When I pulled it back, a trail of white granules fell across the gap, completing our path to the cart. "That worked," I grinned at Daniel, handing back his gun. We reached the cart, which held more rock salt than I dared hope for, enough to create a secure path back to our trapped companions and potentially all the way to the surface. "You get the others," Daniel said, already scooping handfuls of rock salt. "I'll block these things in." I nodded and started laying down a thick salt line back to our circle, where Jessica, Alex, and the boy watched with wide eyes. The creatures grew more agitated as they realized what we were doing, moving faster and making those awful whisper sounds that almost formed words. When I reached the circle, I poured a heavy line around it, reinforcing the barrier. "Can any of you walk?" I asked. Jessica nodded weakly. "I think so. With help. What about the others?" I glanced at the still unconscious woman and man. Alex looked at them sadly. "They haven't moved since I've been awake." I looked back at Daniel, who was systematically blocking tunnels and passageways with thick lines of salt. The creatures retreated from each barrier, moving deeper into the mine complex. "Daniel, we need to carry 2 of them," I called. He jogged back to us, pockets and hands full of rock salt. "I've blocked the 3 main tunnels. They're trapped deeper in the complex for now." Together, we helped Jessica, Alex, and the boy to their feet. They were unsteady, but determined. Daniel lifted the unconscious woman in a fireman's carry, while I struggled with the gas station attendant, managing a clumsy but effective hold. "Follow the salt line," I instructed the others. "Don't step off it, not even an inch." We moved slowly down the main tunnel toward the surface. Behind us, the creatures began making new sounds, not whispers anymore, but high-pitched shrieks that bounced off the stone walls. The noise grew louder as we continued our escape, as if they realized we were taking their collection. "Faster," Daniel urged, adjusting the woman on his shoulders. "I don't think they'll stay trapped for long." We shuffled along as quickly as our weakened companions could manage. Jessica kept stumbling, but Alex held her up, showing surprising strength for someone who'd been captive for 3 years. The tunnel sloped upward, making our progress even slower. My arms ached from carrying the unconscious man, but I pushed through the pain. Daylight appeared ahead, a pale glow at the end of the main shaft. "Almost there," I encouraged everyone. "Just a little further." A particularly loud shriek echoed through the tunnels, closer than the others. I glanced back and saw movement in the darkness behind us. "They're coming," I gasped. "Daniel, we need more salt." He was already pulling more from his pockets, awkwardly creating a thicker line behind us with one hand while supporting the woman with his other arm. The creatures came into view, 3 of them moving together, including the false Jessica. They stopped at Daniel's fresh salt line, shrieking in what sounded like rage. We finally reached the mine entrance, practically spilling out into the sunlight. I laid the gas station attendant on the ground, my arms shaking from exertion, and turned to help the others. Once everyone was outside, Daniel created one final, thick salt line across the entrance. From deep within the tunnels, dozens of inhuman voices shrieked in unison, a sound of fury and frustration that made my skin crawl. The creatures were trapped, at least for now. "We need to seal this place," Daniel said, breathing hard from the effort of carrying the woman. "Later," I replied, checking on our rescued people. "Right now, we need to get them to a doctor." The trip back to town was slow and difficult. We made a stretcher for the gas station attendant using branches in our jackets, while Daniel continued to carry the woman. The others walked on their own with frequent breaks, When we finally reached Daniel's police cruiser, we carefully loaded everyone inside and drove back to town, where the local clinic took the victims in immediately. Dr. Martinez asked no questions when Daniel explained they had been trapped in the mine. In Blackwood, the less said about such things, the better. While Daniel contacted state authorities about permanently sealing the mining complex, I stayed with Jessica and the others at the clinic. They were severely dehydrated and malnourished, but otherwise physically unharmed. The mental impact of their ordeal would take longer to assess. 3 years, Alex kept saying, looking at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. I was down there for 3 years, and I don't remember any of it. None of them remembered anything after being taken, just darkness, then waking up when we found them. Jessica sat on the edge of her hospital bed, sipping water slowly. "You saved my life," she said when I checked on her. "I should have listened to you about the curfew." "You couldn't have known," I replied, though part of me wanted to say, "I told you so." "I know now," she said firmly, "and I'm not leaving Blackwood." I raised my eyebrows in surprise. "You're staying? After what happened?" She nodded. "Someone needs to warn other newcomers, really warn them, not just mention some vague town rule." Her eyes met mine with newfound determination. "Those things are still down there, behind salt barriers that might not hold forever. People need to understand the danger." She was right. Our town had grown too comfortable with hints and vague warnings, assuming people would either figure things out or leave. It wasn't enough anymore. Later that evening, after everyone was stable and resting, Alex asked to speak with me privately. His face looked gaunt in the harsh clinic lighting, but his eyes were clear. "Emily," he said, taking my hand in his trembling one, "thank you. I don't know how long I would have stayed down there if you hadn't come looking." I squeezed his hand gently. "I wasn't even looking for you specifically. I only went after Jessica. But you found all of us." He smiled weakly. "That's the thing about this town. We don't talk about the danger enough, but when someone breaks the rules, we still try to save them." Daniel returned from the police station with news that state officials would arrive tomorrow to assess the mining complex and begin sealing operations. He'd convinced them it was a safety hazard due to structural instability, never mentioning what really lived inside. As I walked home that evening, well before sunset, I thought about how our community handled the danger that surrounded us. For generations, we'd protected ourselves with silence and rules, passing down warnings without explanations. It had kept most of us safe, but at the cost of those who didn't believe quickly enough. Jessica was right. We needed to do better. Not just with salt lines and curfews, but with honest conversations about what lurked in our forest. The rules weren't enough if people didn't understand why they existed. Tomorrow, I would talk to the town council about creating a proper orientation for newcomers. No more vague warnings or hoping they'd learn in time. If people were going to live in Blackwood, they deserved to know what they were living with and what waited in the darkness if they broke the rules.